Hey, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of the Insight to Revenue podcast. We're excited to have you here, and we're very excited to have our special guest, Bill Conry, join us today. Bill, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Zach. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So, Bill and I actually we worked together for many years at our days at CEB, Gartner, and Challenger. But Bill went on to do great things at LinkedIn as a sales enablement and professional development expert. He is also happens to be a professional stand-up comedian, and one of his most passionate topics is how do you bring humor into a boring, stale corporate environment. So we're excited to talk to him today about that topic, and hopefully you get some takeaways for the audience here.
I look forward to it, Zach. We got a lot to cover. A lot to cover to change the boring corporate culture into something a little bit more humorous. But I think
And
you
I
and I
just
can.
noticed we've got, I mean, this is kind of, we've got a between two ferns thing
Oh
going
yeah.
on here. So nicely done. I can't promise Zach Galifianakis level of humor today, but
Let's not set the bar too high. Let's not
yeah,
set.
yeah. I just want this huge stream of water to come across the screen and knock you down. So, Bill, thanks again, man. So, I've been excited about this topic. I think this is going to be a unique one for folks to tune into, with a lot of obviously great, and this is very businessy, but at the same time, I think it's life lessons you can bring into the workplace. So, first topic in this day and age, everyone, it's different in the US than in other places, but humor at work, is it okay? What's good? What's bad? Let's start at the top. What are your thoughts?
Yes. So this is a very complicated topic, and there's been a lot of discussions on the topic of humor at work, especially in the days of cancel culture. Nobody wants to get canceled. What is appropriate? What is inappropriate? Most people, I would say, err on the conservative side. They say you should not incorporate humor into the workplace. The time and place for jokes is not at work. I say that is nonsense. There has never been a better time for humor at work. We need it. We need to be more engaged in our jobs. And there's actually a lot of benefits to humor at the workplace. What's interesting is that there's a ton of academic research on this topic. There's Stanford University business professors that actually study it, that wrote a book about it. But even beyond that, there's all sorts of studies dating back for the past 20 years. A couple highlights from that study shows that executive leaders, a survey of thousands of them, found that 98%, nearly unanimous, prefer employees with a sense of humor. 84% believe employees with a sense of humor do better work. And the main reason for this is that when you use humor, and we'll talk about what that means and how you can leverage humor in just a bit, you are perceived as more confident, more competent, and more intelligent. So just by having a sense of humor, you can work wonders not just for your own career trajectory, your own perception, but also for your organization and for your teams. And on top of that, a couple other studies I could spend the whole time sharing all sorts of
We
statistics,
we
but
love data here.
I'll cut it off maybe after this one. So not just looking at the survey from the standpoint of executive leaders, but just managers, looking at how managers are perceived, your direct manager. 23%, I'm sorry, managers with a sense of humor are 23% more respected, viewed as 24% more pleasant to work with. They're viewed as 17% friendlier. They're 24% more motivated and admired. So in other words, if you have a manager that has a sense of humor, by all accounts, they are better to work with. You enjoy your time with the manager, and they're also a more effective leader. So I think a lot of people are just worried about what is humor going to do for my brand? Am I going to get canceled? Am I going to get fired? Am I going to say something inappropriate? But they forget, Zach, to look at some of the upsides of having a sense of humor and creating this culture of humor at work. So I could go on, but there's tremendous benefits, not just for the organization as a whole, not just for how the manager is affected, but also for teams. Teams being more productive, hitting more goals, they're more efficient, they're more resilient, they're more creative when they have this culture of humor. So I would say by far the benefits of using humor at work, creating a culture of humor outweigh some of the negatives. which are quite obvious. You could get fired, but there is a way to use humor in a way that is not going to get you fired and is going to enhance your enjoyment, your engagement of your job, and also make you more effective and productive. I'll pause there.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think you know what? Like people want to have fun at work. People are going back to the workplace, and so I think I wholeheartedly agree. Like, let's not offend anybody, but if you're clever about it, how do you bring entertainment? How do you bring humor? Let's start with a lot of the audience here today is are going to be in leadership positions,
Yeah.
and they want to know sort of how do I using those statistics, like how do I become more appealing, engaging, entertaining? How do I get the attention of my audience? I obviously there's things you do as a stand-up comedian that may not work in the workplace, but where do you start?
Yeah. So where do you start with how to be funny? So I'm actually going to back up. And the best place to start in terms of having a sense of humor, it's not writing jokes, it's not becoming Jerry Seinfeld or Chris Rock overnight. Because a lot of people say, I am just not funny. Now, that's another topic I could talk about. I think comedians are made, not born. But studies show that the best way to create a culture of humor isn't necessarily by telling jokes, it's by enabling humor, enabling this warmth, this levity. It's maybe by laughing at other people's jokes, laughing at yourself. So you don't necessarily have to be the one with the microphone that is, creating the jokes, getting on stage and making everybody laugh. You can simply, as a leader, be the one that is enabling humor. So that's my first tip.
Great. And I mean, I guess if you think about that in different settings and environments, um, should people pre-plan to be funny?
Yeah. So the other thing that I'll share with humor, Zach, there's of course different styles of humor. You look at all the different comedians that are out there. You think about your friends that are funny. They're they're all not telling the same types of jokes. Some are more of a dark sense of humor. Some are more of a warm sense of humor. Some are more kind of witty, more of like a sniper. Some are more of a sweetheart sense of humor. So there isn't a one size fits all. And I think if you use the lens of trying to be somebody else, you are sort of assessing your humor on the scale of Jerry Seinfeld. How similar am I to Jerry Seinfeld? You're probably not going to get there. So the biggest tip is to be yourself, be authentic. I know that that sounds cheesy, that probably sounds generic, but try to use jokes, use your sense of humor in a way that is natural to you. Because if you're not being yourself, it shows. In the stand-up comedy scene here in Dublin, thank you for calling me a professional comedian, by the way. I mean, I do get paid sometimes, so technically I am a professional, but
We're gonna
I'm
make sure
far
we
from
post some YouTube links under this when it goes live, so people can
yeah,
check you
it's
out.
self-fulfilling. Bill Conry, professional comedian. I guess that would help me. But let's just say a Netflix special has not been released yet.
Yet.
The advice that I was given when I first took a stand-up comedy class was take your personality. So let's say you are nerdy, you're neurotic, you are shy. Crank it up to an 11 out of 10. So you're sort of like the extreme version of yourself, and you want that to come through in your act. The worst thing that you could do is try to be somebody else. You're trying to take on the tone, the persona, the joke style of a comedian that is not you. It is abundantly clear what is natural and what is not. I run an open mic. I see comedians of all different levels. We actually have some of the top comedians in Ireland popping in. We have some of the newest and some of the worst comedians as well. And I see time and time again, a lot of the comedians, I get to know them off stage, they're trying to be somebody else on stage, and it is just not connecting. So the takeaway for leaders, for managers, try to be yourself. They don't have to necessarily crank up their personality to an 11 out of 10. Maybe it's a 10 out of 10. Maybe it's an 8 out of 10. But try to use jokes, stories in the tone and style that is natural to you. Because if you are trying to be this alternate persona, that will be crystal clear, and it's not going to be as funny and as relatable and as authentic.
I think that's pretty wise, and we're gonna break down. We're gonna really get into the topic to see for some really tactical situations. I think
Yeah.
And so I'm putting you on the spot here. I know you don't have any silver bullet answers on some of these things, but I think as we think about tension, everyone thinks like, oh yeah, like I frequently realize like, oh, if I had just used humor instead of digging in on an issue, I would have been able to relieve the tension in that
Yeah.
situation. And that's really important to be able to do as a leader. It's also really important if you're the type of leader who wants to believe in transparency and radical candor and straight shoot. Like you've got to actually, if you're willing to go into tough conversations, you've also got to be willing to kind of alleviate the tension somehow and know when to cut bait on those situations, right? I don't think
Mhm.
I'm very good at that. Sometimes I wish I was able to tell a joke and kind of take, lighten things up. So I guess what would you say as far as like a manager who's having, coaching sessions and wants to actually have some of those tough conversations? Like when is humor appropriate? How do you get a read for it? And for folks who feel like, hey, they're just simply not funny, like what are some advice you can give as they prepare to go into those, coaching interactions with their team? Say they're a sales
Yeah.
manager with an AE or a CSM.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do have, I think this might have been part of your last question, but we can get to some practical and tactical ways to incorporate humor. So I can maybe share that in my next response. But one of those ways that I actually had thought of prior is in these tense moments, or in a coaching interaction, or maybe even doing a performance conversation. Humor is a great way to diffuse tension. However, it could completely backfire.
Mm.
If you are in this tense moment, you're having a serious conversation with your boss, and then they crack a joke that maybe you don't think is funny, or you just don't think it's appropriate given the context. It could be the best joke in the world, but you just don't think it's funny given the context. That can absolutely backfire. However, I have heard many stories. So I used to run workshops when I worked at LinkedIn on this exact topic. We would discuss exactly the question you mentioned. We talk about how can you practically incorporate humor as a manager. Have you ever used it in tense conversations? And you'd be surprised how many managers have incorporated humor. There's maybe just a quick joke to diffuse the tension. By the way, I don't have, if you are thinking I'm going to rattle off all these great dad jokes that you can use, you got to do your own homework. You could do some Googling. But just a quick joke at a tense moment when it's maybe not too tense. So maybe the tension is building up. And before maybe it gets a little bit too awkward, a little bit too much, especially if that's not your intention and that's not the path you want to go down, it can be diffused pretty quickly by making a quick joke that is, of course, appropriate. And here's the other thing with humor in the workplace, whether it's a manager conversation or it's you could be at a team meeting, giving a presentation internally, whatever the context might be, there's a lower bar for what is funny. So in other words, it is the intent that matters. So if you're in a tense meeting with your manager, he cracks a bad joke, but the intent is there. It's clear that Zach is trying to diffuse the tension a bit to maybe show his softer side and, not make you upset. That is quite powerful. Maybe the joke is not going to get a laugh, but at least the intention is clear. And that same strategy, that same tactic works in other contexts as well. You could be sharing a joke during a presentation, during a team meeting, etc. Even if it is a bad joke, A, people will probably laugh because they're not expecting it. It's work. Everything else is boring. But B, it just shows that you at least have a sense of humor. So it's the thought that counts, for lack of a better word. Showing that you are at least attempting to diffuse the tension can be helpful. So just to put a button on this thumb. What's the word I'm looking for?
We'll
I'm
put a pin in it. We'll put
a
a
pin in
we'll
it.
pin
Yeah.
it. We'll pin it up. Is
Yeah.
that? We'll
I'm
go
a,
with it.
I'm a comedian. I'm not a wordsmith. Um, Using humor in a tense conversation can be a great way to diffuse tension if that is your intention. However, be aware of how that could be perceived if maybe the joke is not appropriate itself, or maybe the circumstances, the context is not appropriate for humor. So use your best judgment. And also, it depends on the audience as well. The rapport you have with the direct report, and I guess how appreciative and supportive of a joke in that context you think they will be. So
Yeah, and
long
I
answer to a short question.
it's I mean let's shift the focus a little bit to external because I think
Yeah.
one of the things that we see more and more these days, especially now that people are getting out and seeing customers, is the value of wanting to work with the person on the other side of the desk, right? And so there's this less tangible aspect of, okay, maybe I like your product, maybe I don't. But at the end of the day, if I've had meetings with you and I actually enjoy working with you as a partner, as a vendor or supplier, that actually it seems to matter. It makes you more memorable. And I know for a fact, when I've worked successfully with teams, a lot of times we're not making fun of the customer. We're making fun of each other in front of the customer, showing that we have fun. We actually really enjoy what we're doing. We're a close knit team, and it brings them into that. And it seems to have been one of the things that has always worked really well for my teams is that we try to be natural and we try to be like, hey, you can imagine working with us. We're going to have fun on this project. But as far as like people thinking about, wow, like if I'm a salesperson, if I'm an AE and I'm going into a client situation with some very senior people, how should I think about how entertaining I want to be? And this treads into storytelling,
Yeah.
using humor. You've got a lot of experience with this and with developing talent as well. So, like, what's the kind of advice is for preparing for those customer meetings, and
Yeah.
how do you try to bring more entertainment and memorable differentiation to the experience?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of benefits for using humor in sales and just in customer interactions. And there's five that come to mind. First, it gets attention. So this could be for the initial outreach. Everyone is overwhelmed. They're bombarded by messages from salespeople. They probably take a lot of meetings as well. Using humor can help you stand out. You also establish credibility. People that are humorous, again, back to that study I initially shared, they are viewed as more competent and more confident as well. So you establish credibility with the customer, with the prospect, by just demonstrating that you have a sense of humor. It also creates some sort of an element of surprise. So this is more of a tactical part, and I can talk more about this in a moment. But if you're kicking off a sales meeting, especially starting with a joke or inserting humor early on, it kind of breaks the mold. It also reduces some of the tension. It sets the tone in a way that it gets the audience on your side, so to speak, and the audience being the senior executive or the prospect. So this element of surprise is just not going to be a typical sales presentation. Think about all the sales presentations that a typical, let's say, CFO or CMO sits through in the course of a month, probably a lot. And they
Yeah.
all kind of blend together. You know just as well as I do. We've studied this. We've worked with companies that have suffered through this. Everything kind of blends together. I don't care how shiny your pitch deck is. I don't care what kind of buzzwords you use. It all kind of blends together. The products are probably very similar as well. So simply breaking the mold, inserting just maybe a little joke at the start of the presentation or even at some stage throughout, that makes you more memorable. And it also very quickly builds rapport. Humor is a way, there's more studies on this. I'm not going to get into the numbers, but humor is a way, to your point, Zach, that it brings people together. You said your teams would like to you kind of joke around with the customers and bring them. They feel like they're kind of part of the team. It's a great way to quickly build rapport, and this is true internally and externally. If you are laughing together, you are establishing more credibility and connecting closer. So for all those reasons, it is definitely to your advantage to be incorporating some sort of joke. Now, I think your question was, how do you know that the joke is appropriate? Now, there are so many different types of company cultures, and I've been fortunate to consult and train with many, all sorts of different regions, all sorts of different geographies, and other cultures, some more liberal, some more conservative. So I think step 1A is to understand the culture of the company. Are they young? Look at just their general messaging. How formal are they? What do they wear to the office? And in general, those companies are going to be more receptive to humor. So I've delivered workshops with young tech companies, and I have a sense. I've worked at a young tech company. I know what kind of jokes are going to fly. I also think they're going to be receptive to the concept of humor. But then there's some more conservative, older companies that are in more traditional industries that, just based on everything I know that I have to kind of be careful. Now, that doesn't mean you don't use jokes at all, but it's just maybe test the waters, try to understand more about the culture and also the individuals themselves before you go in guns blazing. The worst thing that you can do, and I have made this mistake before, and a lot of my facilitation facilitation workshops with clients, I start right off the bat with a joke. And I think that's a great way to get the audience on your side. I have had those jokes bomb, not because they're bad jokes. So I do a joke comparing myself to Jim Carrey and to the dad from Modern Family. You can laugh. People think that I look like him, and I incorporate that into my introduction. And I think that they just weren't ready for the joke, which isn't necessarily the end of the world. That's not necessarily the reason to not make a joke. But I think that they just generally did not have the appetite for humor. They did eventually, but I had to sort of earn the credibility first. So that would be my other piece of advice. Maybe you don't go in guns blazing. If you're unclear about the sense of humor of that individual and that company culture, you can wait to test the waters, build some credibility first, earn the right. They don't want you don't want to be perceived as just this jokester that doesn't know anything about their industry and is just there to entertain. So you could hold off if you're unsure and test the waters, understand the culture, and then maybe once you have credibility, that's when the jokes and the stories can flow more freely. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I had a lot to say on that topic, but hopefully that is somewhat helpful.
I think it does. And I was going to challenge you on what the five things were, because when you said five, I made sure to take note. And I think I've got them down here. It's gets attention, it's builds credibility, it's the element of surprise, it's the rapport building that you need, and that chemistry with the customer, and then actually tailoring that to the culture
Yeah,
of the audience, and being thoughtful before you go into a German engineering company that's family owned for 100 years and you
right,
make
right.
the wrong joke.
Yeah.
So those all sound like great tips. Um, I was going to ask you, as you think about your, I mean, I've always really been impressed by your style of how you coach and develop talent, how you do facilitation. So let's go beyond sort of the topic of comedy itself. Like for you, uh, what do you think is unique about how you approach a development session, whether it's a one-on-one or a group session with people? How would you describe your style and how you try to really tap into to driving the outcomes and behavior change in those sessions personally?
Yeah, of course. So first and foremost, I use humor. I think that that kind of goes without saying. Tactically speaking, when I am facilitating, there's two main places in the workshop. Let's say it's a 2 hour training or even a full day training that I know that I need to nail. Any guesses which places those are, Zach?
It's I'll go with the opening to build credibility and the closing to
Very
give
good.
them next
Very good.
steps. Is that
Yeah. I guess it's kind of an obvious question when you think about it, but I'll explain the reason behind it. There's a lot of research behind this. If you know Daniel Kahneman, sort of the godfather of behavioral economics, prospect theory, Nobel Prize winner, he has another research topic called the peak end rule. We as human beings are psychologically conditioned to recall the emotional peak or valley. So that could be you're at a amusement park, you go on the craziest roller coaster, or you're on vacation and you go on a dune buggy, and then also the end of any experience. And this could be over the course of a relationship, over the course of a day, or over the course of a 2 hour sales meeting or a sales training, whatever it might be. So the emotional peak, I think that could be harder to capture in a short meeting. That could be a separate topic. There are some ways you can maybe do contests. You could tell emotional stories. You could kind of try to create some emotional element, get everybody excited. That could be hard, but the end part is 100% true. That is what people are going to remember. Whether you like it or not, they are going to remember the end. A month from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, that is the part that's going to stand out in your mind. So because this is such important real estate, you have to nail that. And so I design most of my trainings, and when I'm actually executing them, I try to make sure that the end is very crisp and very clear. So we covered a lot. It could always feel like drinking from a fire hose depending on the topic, but here's what I want you to know. Not the 12 takeaways, maybe the 3 or 4 takeaways. And here's what I want you to do differently, or here's what I want you to do next. And also, you probably want to leave them smiling. You probably want to leave them happy. Um, that's what they're going to recall that's their perception of you. So you have to really nail the ending, make it crisp, make it clear, maybe make it a little bit different. And then the beginning is the other point. So that's not part of the peak end rule, but I added that point. Stand-up comedians focus on the start and end of their sets. If you go to any stand-up comedy show, you watch a Netflix special, you will notice that the first joke they tell and the last joke they tell consistently get the most laughs. And that is by design. Because at the start, you need to get everybody on your side. So whether that's using humor or using some other tactics, you have to kind of break the mold at the start. I
Yeah.
like to start with a cold open. So I'm not just coming out saying, here's the agenda. We've got 2 hours together. We're going to do this, this, and this. I like to start with maybe a question for the group. Maybe I just break right into a story before I even introduce myself. I ran a workshop back at LinkedIn, my former company, and I tell a story about a Hungarian psychologist. And I start the workshop, I say, who here has been to Budapest? And we start talking about Budapest, and it just catches people off guard. It really captures their attention right away. So you have to start off real strong and start off a bit differently to kind of break the mold. But then at the same time, you have to establish credibility. So you have to make sure that people know that this person not just has some jokes or has an innovative way of kicking off a workshop, they actually have credibility and they have experience in this regard. So I try to make sure that those 2 points, whether it's the first 30 minutes, the first 15 minutes, or even the first 5 minutes, and the last, let's say, 30 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, those are just so crucial. Those are what I double down on. Well, I'll pause there. Any questions on sort of that strategy of focusing on the start and the end?
No, I mean it's pretty good advice, and I think it's pretty obvious that you've got to start strong and
Yep.
stick the landing. I was just thinking I watched a movie recently and I can't remember what it was called, but it's a bunch of people in a cruise ship. I won't spoil it, but like for half the time I'm thinking like what on earth is going on in this film? Do I hate it? Do I love it? But I'm like I'm going to wait until the end and because with a lot if the complete picture comes together, my feeling of that meeting or that movie is going to be a positive one based on like was that pointless of what I just went through? You probably know what film I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a anyways, and so I think that it is. It's like people will remember for that, and actually in a lot of the training we do at Insight Revenue, there's a concept of putting a bow on especially on your first meeting, where you have to stick the landing as far as like, hey, maybe I run a discovery or a demo call, and I'm trying to remember like what is the story that I heard at the end, I got to put it all back together in a way that they agree so we can drive to the next step and there's
Yeah.
validation and qualification. Like putting that's something we actually train people to do is to figure out how do I stick that landing and pull it all together because if you
Yeah.
end poorly, the memory of that meeting is like, wow, there was, and they go on, they talk to somebody else, they even forget what happened. There's no actionable next steps. You don't know if you qualified them or not. And so I think it all really does fold together
Yeah.
as an important lesson that you can prepare for, right?
100%. Yeah. So making sure there's kind of crisp, clear takeaways that everyone kind of got the big picture that you wanted them to walk away with. And you reminded me of another tactic I use when I'm just thinking about the design and the execution of trainings. It's making everything digestible. There could be a complex topic that is covered or a complex theory, and it could feel abstract, it could be confusing, and just being able to break it down into a digestible piece. So, this is what I want you to take away from this. So, we just did this whole discussion and we did this activity on maybe it was product training back in my LinkedIn days. Here's what I want you to know. Here's the big picture. Here's the digestible piece. This is what you should do differently. And one way to do that is to actually remove people from their own world. And by that, I mean, it's very easy to get bogged down into the details. Let's say you work for a tech company, and instead of using all examples about a sales process or I don't know, a product feature from that company, if you're trying to make a point around maybe a new sales tactic to use, sometimes getting out of that world and you're telling a story from another industry, or maybe you're just telling a story about your personal life, that is really helpful to illustrate the concept because people can't pick apart. If you're giving an example exactly from their industry, there are definitely benefits to it. But if the whole point is to illustrate a concept or a methodology, they could pick apart the example. I don't know if I would actually say that. And technically, we stopped selling that product 6 months ago. But if you're giving an example from your personal life, so for instance, with some of my clients, I gave a story just recently. I had to buy a credit card reader machine at a department store in Dublin for the comedy night that I run. And they basically, the salesperson did not know what he was doing, and he could have upsold me on a more expensive device. And there was an opportunity to use insights. I won't get into the details, but it illustrated the concept, but it wasn't from the world of the customer, but they could absolutely relate to it because it's just a kind of real world examples. So I love that. I'm not the first facilitator to do that, but just kind of removing people from their own world, sharing personal stories about, I don't know, renovating their kitchen or their experience with a personal trainer, something non-business related or another industry. I think that's incredibly helpful and powerful.
I think the question that's most on everyone's mind right now, since we heard about you being a stand-up comic from the beginning here, is, we all know that there's the good days and there's the bad days. I find it's very curious to always find out what is it really like to totally bomb or to
Hmm.
have, what is the worst stand-up experience you've ever had and survived to be here today. Um,
Yeah.
take us to that dark moment so we can all live vicariously through you.
I don't know what this says about humanity, or maybe it's just my friends. I get asked all the time, have you ever bombed? I'm never asked, tell me about your best gig ever. But I guess people are more interested in the negatives. I guess we are drawn to that psychologically. But I do have a story. I'm going to answer your question, but first tell you about the best gig I had because it was actually a day apart from the worst gig I've had. I've only outright bombed Zach one time. You could call me the Unabomber. Little joke there. You've been waiting for some jokes. So I'll tell you that story. So I was
I
in,
got my drum kit over here in the corner of the room. Actually, this is
oh,
just for
check
this
it out.
one.
I was in a competition in Galway. It's a pretty well-known comedy competition. The winner wins a spot at a massive festival, and there's second place, third place, and there's various heats. So there's comedians from all over Ireland and the UK. So you have to qualify to get in. I have my first heat in Galway, and it's in front of about 150 people, which at the time was maybe my biggest set ever. I tend to do very well with an Irish audience. Most of my jokes are about being an American in Ireland. Most of my good jokes, I should say. It is nearly all Irish. It's mostly college students. It's my sweet spot. Zach, I murdered that night. I've never rocked a room so hard. The instant I left the stage, I'm like, I've got to be moving on to the finals. This is just the initial heat. And I did move on to the finals. People are taking pictures with me afterwards. I saw a guy on the street the next day. He's like, "Oh my God, you were so great last night." Literally that next day. So that's act one. But don't worry, it's going to get worse. I have a gig the next day back in Dublin at a bar in Temple Bar. If you haven't been to Dublin, Temple Bar is, well, there's a bar called Temple Bar, but it's also the neighborhood, the touristy neighborhood.
Mhm.
If an American family is in Dublin for a weekend, they'll probably hang out in Temple Bar the whole time. So I have a gig that night. I've done this show a number of times. It's always been a pretty good room. I've done pretty well there. I'm feeling very confident. Like, got this little gig after I made it to the finals of this countrywide competition. Sure, I'll show up. Now, I always alter my sets a bit for a more of a foreign audience. I did not change the set enough. I also did not know who was in the audience. I got there kind of late. The host had kind of, you normally get a feel for where people are from. So it turns out there's not a single Irish person. There's also not a single American. It's a mixture of Dutch tourists, German tourists, Japanese tourists, a lot of non-native English speakers, which are generally not the best comedy crowd. There's very little commonality in the jokes that they all get. So it tends to be a tough audience when that's the case, especially when most of my jokes have something to do with Ireland. They don't live in Ireland. They don't even know much about Ireland. So I went down like a lead balloon, Zach. It was kind of like, actually, I would say it was more like the frog in the boiling water. Normally, my first joke just like kills a couple chuckles, and it was getting progressively worse. I almost prefer that nobody laughed at the start and I maybe just exited the stage or tried to do crowd work or something to save myself. But by the end of it, it was just crickets. I had completely lost the room. They were not on my side. I didn't offend anybody or anything like that, But laughter tends to build the momentum. You get everyone laughing, and then the jokes get funnier and funnier. Even if they're not that funny, people are just laughing because of that momentum. I never built momentum, and by the end, my last joke was about Cork, which is a county in Ireland, which was a terrible choice of joke because nobody knows the cultural nuances of Cork, and I don't think a single person laughed. And normally after a show, after you perform, even if you do bad, the other comedians in the back waiting to go on, they'll say, "Oh, good set." They give you a little fist bump or something like that. My friend comes up to me and he's like one of the nicest comedians on the scene in Dublin. And he says, "Are you okay? Floor fell out below you and you could never get back on it." And then afterwards, the showrunner, the guy that books the comedians, was like, "Why did you do so many Irish jokes? This is an international crowd." So it was terrible. But what I learned from it, so I don't worry, I have survived. It's not fun, especially because it was my first time outright bombing. What I learned from it is you really need to know the audience. And it sounds pretty obvious, but understand just what are the nuances. What does everybody in that room have in common? What can everybody relate to? So when I have an all Irish audience, I can talk about Irish women's names. We have this weird thing in Ireland. You have to register your TV. You have to pay a license fee, and like half the people don't pay it. I make a joke about that. No one's going to get that if they're not from Ireland. So you have to know what does everybody have in common. And the challenge can be at these touristy bars, it's not just this one, when you have so many diverse cultures, people from all over, it can be hard to find that commonality. But there's a way to do it. I mean, there's certain relatable stories and topics. Everybody can relate to airports. There's a reason why there's so many jokes about airports and airplanes. It's just a topic that everyone can relate to. And my takeaway for my professional life, for facilitating, for giving speeches, and also some of the advice that I give my clients, try to find what is that common thread in the room. Maybe you are presenting to all salespeople, all marketers, all finance people, all people in Spain or France. And if you're trying to make a joke or just tell a story or make a reference, think about that thread that they all have in common. Everybody works in the same industry. You might have to get pretty broad if it's a bigger group, but being aware of who is in the room and what do they all have in common, that is critical in order to engage a room and get the audience on your side.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that very personal story with us, Bill. It's great to have you here. Obviously, Matt Dixon does travel around as your opening act most of the time from our first episode, and this has been hugely valuable. I heavily enjoyed the conversation. Lots of takeaways. I mean, we even got into peak end rule, and so I think there's so much in here for our audience to learn. And so I appreciate your time. I'm going to ask you to make sure you hang on for this to upload to the cloud, and maybe we'll have you back on again someday soon. So thanks again, Bill. Really appreciate it.